So we have a pretty much logical error here in our code. We have the problem that we have the hard-coded ID, and we already learned how we can find and fix this error. Now let's say we didn't use any of the other two approaches, we overlooked that warning, and we don't know why it's behaving incorrectly. In such cases, if you can't find the error otherwise, or if you just prefer this approach maybe, you can go to the Sources tab here in the browser developer tools. And there you find in the end the source files that are being used on this web page right now. And that includes your JavaScript code. And the cool thing is that this React development process, this npm start script here, which runs in the end, is set up such that it, of course, pushes code to the browser that is executable by the browser, but it also gives the browser extra information which the browser developer tools are able to pick up to allow us to actually debug our code in the raw form we wrote it in. So that we are able to debug with that code we're writing in these files, even though that technically isn't the code that's executed by the browser. So this React development process gives the browser a bridge between the code that runs in the browser and the code we wrote. And we can access this code here in the Sources tab by going to that users folder, which you should see. Users, your username, and then a source folder, and in there you find your React files, the files we actually also have here in our IDE. Now, if you don't find it here, you can also check out that Webpack folder, and there you might also find a source folder with your source files. You can look around because sometimes it's located in a different node, in a different subfolder, but somewhere here in the Sources tab, in this tree of files and folders, you should find your original source code. And then you could always dive into the different parts that you want to analyze. You could go into the course goal item, and there, for example, the delete handler, and simply add a breakpoint by clicking onto the line number where you want to add it. In this case, that delete handler function, which is triggered when we click on a list item, because that's where the deletion process starts. So maybe that is where we want to pause the code and then step through the code step by step so that we can find the problem. Once you add such a breakpoint, if you then execute that action that triggers that code part where the breakpoint is placed, code execution stops once it reaches that breakpoint line. So you see that here it's paused in the debugger, and that line is now highlighted in blue here, and you got surrounding information in those boxes at the bottom. For example, you see variables which are currently available, you see the call stack, and so on. And now you can do something cool. You can step through your code step by step. And for example, here we call the onDelete method on the props object, for example. So to have a look at what's going on there, we can use this step into next function call button. If we click that, we're in the delete item handler, which is the function that was triggered because of that props concept. And here we see that set course goals function which is being called. And you can also hover over variables here to see the values that are currently stored in them. And for example, if I hover over goal ID here, I see that it is goal 1. Now, this might or might not help me here, but I can see that I have goal 1 here when I clicked on this goal, which was actually the second goal I added. Now we can use the step over next function call button here to finish that set course goals function call. So now with that, the delete item handler basically finished, and the information we got is that we had the goal ID goal 1 for the goal we deleted, which, as we of course know, is the wrong goal to delete. So now we could resume script execution because we're done with this debugging cycle, and simply try this again and click on the next goal and dive into the next function call here and see that here we have the same goal ID as before. So now this should be a point where we see, wait a second, if we have the same ID on two different goals on which I clicked here, that seems to be the problem why the wrong goal was deleted. So that's maybe the point where we resume script execution and then dive back into the code where we actually add goals, because that is where we set our IDs. And just by looking at that code, we of course should be able to see why we have goal 1 for every goal. So that's how we can use the breakpoints to step through our code step by step and even inspect values which are stored in variables and so on to find out why something behaves the way it does behave. So breakpoints, and you can always clear them by clicking on them again, breakpoints are another useful tool for analyzing your code, for understanding it, and for finding and fixing errors like that. And with that, I'll revert this to math random toString, which of course then is an ID we can use without getting that warning. Now if I try this again, you see I don't get that warning. If I now add multiple goals, you see if I click on the first goal, I delete the first goal. So this now works, and that's another important set of tools. The debugging tools you got natively in your browser. Here I showed it in the Chrome browser, but you also have similar tools in Firefox or Safari.